Hi, I'm Jeff Townsend from the Critical Minerals International Alliance. The Alliance brings together the CMA, the Critical Mineral Associations in the UK, Australia, the EU, and our partner association, C2M2A in Canada. We met with Ludivine before. We spoke about strategic projects within the CRMA and kind of the agenda and the direction the EU has taken. And I just thought to myself, gee whiz, there is so much more that we need to discuss that I've asked Ludivine to come back and have another chat. Ludivine, thank you ever so much for joining us. Can I quickly get you to introduce yourself for those who didn't join us in the first time we spoke, just to say who you are, where you're from, and your background?
Sure. Thanks, Jeff, for having another conversation with me about the EU of all topics. So my name is Ludivine Wouters. I advise mining companies and investors on growth and strategy and governance. And also over the last few years, I've increasingly been working with policy shapers on critical mineral strategies, responsible sourcing strategies, and what they actually mean in terms of how these policy shapers connect to financial and industrial markets. So I've been, of course, looking a lot at what the EU has been doing on the CRM Act and in the context of its partnerships with resource-rich countries.
Amazing. Well, thank you ever so much for joining us. Unlike last time, which was sunny here, it is now today a relatively bad rainstorm, so I hope it doesn't seem too dark where I am, but we'll deal with the lights if we have to.
True.
You'll be getting it in a couple of hours' time. Last time we spoke about a broad range of things, and I think one of the things that really stuck out to me was the difference between domestic agendas, the difference within domestic agendas across the EU, and how the mandate / no mandate of the CRMA industrial strategy set from the EU wide kind of they somewhat align, but there is more that could be done. And there were two things out of that. The first one was I wondered what the policy priorities are then of the EU, of critical minerals, of course, but the wider agenda. Are they more focused on the upstream, on the midstream, downstream? Where is the policy levers coming from, or is the first question I had. And then really my second question was the Commission versus Parliament. Who's driving this and why? So the first question is, policy priorities. Where's the EU headed and why?
Well, it's a topical and timely question because, we just had European elections in June, which means that we are now negotiating the mandate, but also the structure of the next commission. The next commission has to be approved, of course, by the parliament. So there's a lot of back and forth there. And the calendar takes us to the end of the year with the new commission coming in November. So this is really the moment where 5 years of strategic priorities that hinged on the Green Deal, on a lot of transition goals, is being put to the test of a new political reality in the parliament, but also a new global reality. We've, in the last 5 years, gone through COVID, gone through supply chain stresses that had not actually been on any policy shaper's radar for decades. And of course, the war in Ukraine, which has completely re-geared the EU's thinking about everything from energy to its suppliers, to its immediate neighborhood, and of course, defense. So the steps that are being taken involve both a change of the people, but also of the whole agenda. And end of June, the Council, which brings together the 27 member states, came together to adopt their strategic agenda for 2024 to 2029. Interestingly, the previous strategic agenda, which then carries into the Commission's plan of action, as I said, was heavily focused on the Green Deal, was heavily focused on all of these, environmental and climate and sustainability targets, which have been key to how the EU has defined itself and positioned its industry. If you look at the strategic agenda that's just been adopted, first and foremost, of course, there's a point on a free and democratic Europe, which has always been essential because the internal market is based on a political and social, alliance as well as economic. But of course, all of that is more relevant when you're looking at a more dispersed, more complex European Parliament with a rise of nationalist and sometimes extremely anti-Europe agenda. So, the internal market and the well-being of the citizens is suddenly a whole new discussion after the last elections. The other points on the strategic agenda are a strong and secure Europe, which reflects the last 9 months, the emergence of the economic security agenda. So we've really now starting to connect the dots in the priorities from supply to industry to defense to, economic collaboration and cooperation with other countries and regions. And of course, the prosperous and competitive Europe portion of the strategic agenda is where all of this sort of comes down to, okay, how do we do this better together? There is really a push for the EU to rethink some of its essential pillars. It's not just creating a new industrial policy mandate. It's also, okay, do our competition rules serve us or hurt us? When we're facing the likes of China, which has an extremely integrated economy with a lot of, state-led decision-making, no one is advocating for that. But do we need to rethink how European companies or companies operating in the EU can actually come together and make strategic decisions together? There is a whole thought process about rethinking competition law. Do all of our trade policy and foreign policy actually serve us? The EU has developed a totally new concept of raw materials diplomacy in the last 9 months. 2 years, actually. It's been crystallized since the CRM Act, but it's been in effect a bit longer than that. So the priorities are multiple, but at the core of it are 2 key questions. The first one is, how do we secure Europe for an increasingly fragmented, complex, and frankly, dangerous world? And the second one is, how do we make sure that we do this together in a way that we solidify the union instead of, letting it sort of brittle away?
Okay. And given the changes that we've seen politically within the EU, are we likely to see a continuation of the Commission's leadership and thought leadership, or are we entering untested waters?
Frankly, sometimes it depends on who you're asking the question of. So there isn't a sense of continuity because the Council at its last meeting, end of June, did endorse Ursula von der Leyen to be, the candidate for a renewal of her presidency of the Commission. So to some extent, you see a sort of follow-on. The group that came out, with the biggest representation in the EU Parliament is the EPP, which is the group that Ursula von der Leyen comes from. They were already very big in the previous parliament, and you can see that the grand alliance of EPP, Renew, and the Socialist and Democrat group is again at the heart or at the core of defining the stakes. But underneath that, there's actually a lot of fundamental change. one of the things that I find interesting about the new parliament is that it is very fragmented. Building a majority for any decision, particularly the vote to approve von der Leyen and her commission, is going to be slightly harder than before. This expectation that the grand coalition of three, with its roughly 400 MEPs, can get things done. When you look at attrition rates in various types of votes, when you look at the tensions between the Greens, who've lost a lot of seats, but at the same time remain essential to building a really sturdy majority on some decisions, and then the rise of ECR and a number of other far-right groups, building consensus on some of the key decisions is going to be harder. And yet, in my view, the main outcome is that the parliament will push a lot more of its requirements, expectations, because getting parliament to approve anything, again, including the appointment of the commission, will require more negotiation, which means more leverage. So I think it's going to be a very bumpy ride for the next 6 months. And I'm not sure that means that everything will be smooth and settled for the 5 years that follow.
Interesting. It's, I mean, as an outsider looking in, I did lobby in Brussels for a number of years, but as someone, as a Brit, looking into the EU and where to go and who has the power, I mean, is sometimes baffling. And that's replicated in, this act versus this act and which one supersedes the other. And, it becomes quite a maze through which you have to try and navigate, which is why I'm so glad to be talking to. In fact, you're the only person I ever, if there's a problem in Europe, speak to Ludivine. That's basically my
Goodness.
my position. So with that, when we talk specifically on critical minerals, if let's say there's a British company, Australian company, Canadian, US, Serbian, whatever, where do you go? Who do you talk to? What on critical minerals? Where are the driving? Where are the key points of power within the EU?
Let's be honest, the critical minerals agenda is fundamentally the Commission's push, because it was the Commission's attempt to sort of carve back out an industrial policy mandate it didn't have. There's a few things to consider. First of all, within the Commission, DG GROW, the internal market DG, is really the one that is supposed to be the linkage point between European industries' needs, expectations, requirements, and how that translates into a whole series of policies from EU level to coordinating with member states to financing and to the rest. I honestly think that some of that translation needs to be improved, optimized. I'm not necessarily always feeling that European industrial priorities, investment priorities, are actually reflected in the CRM agenda, nor that the CRM agenda really takes into account the level of appetite, capacity, or sheer existence of one or another capacity and skill within the EU. So I do think that we need to increase the internal cohesion around the agenda. Behind DG GROW, there's a whole series of other actors, because the CRM agenda doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens with partners. So you have DG International Partnerships heading up the initiative on the strategic partnerships. The EU has signed strategic partnerships with 12 or 13 countries so far, and is now also integrating CRM stakes to its free trade agreements, for example, with Indonesia at the moment. So there's a lot of different parts. Two things to note. The first one is that in the run-up to the elections, everybody had an opinion and put out a manifesto about what needed to happen. Policy coherence and moving from let's adopt regulation to no, actually, let's make sure it all works together. Let's maybe streamline it and focus on action. Policy coherence and focus on implementation was a request across every industry voice, but also from civil society. So there's a clear expectation that the Commission has to go from a flurry of initiatives to really honing in and getting it done. I think that's going to require really understanding what European industry wants to do. The second aspect of this is that as we move towards implementation, as we move towards, focusing on outcomes instead of outputs, there is a need to make sure that the wider social expectations are met. And I think civil society has been ignored in quite a bit of the discussions around the CRM agenda in particular, or has not been understood with some of its expectations. And that is going to also have to, now come into the conversation, be dealt with, be addressed intelligently across the 27 member states at the same time. So not exactly business as usual.
That's interesting because there's a perception that the EU as a political entity is better at listening to civil society than, say, the UK or others. There's a greater power for civil society to have an influence and to change the course. And yet you're telling me that within the CRM space, that's not necessarily been the case. Which then leads me to a question, which is, as last time we spoke about strategic projects. Are we hitting a point now where we're aiming for strategic projects because we think they are the ones that are going to drive EU industry, and yet these projects are going to be under greater civil society spotlights, which I've got no problem with, but you could argue could be a driver for slowing down the implementation of these projects going forward?
Yeah, I think it's worth just looking at the process that got us to adoption of the CRM Act. The CRM Act, as it was proposed by the Commission, was very different from the version that was adopted by the Parliament. The Parliament expressed a lot of ambitions, which are the direct outcome of civil society's expectations. And you could see a lot of the positions that are driven by civil society representation in the Parliament's version. Things like, for example, a push for a united, financing conduit at European level. That came from the Parliament. It was removed by the Council, and it didn't make it into the final CRM Act. Same thing, for example, on the very forward positions that the Parliament put into the CRM Act on resource efficiency, effectively making the point that sourcing responsibly at all stages of the value chain is essential, but not prioritizing usage, not having key rules or at the very least some principles about how do we ensure that industry uses these precious materials correctly. That's a failure in and of itself. The Parliament pushed very unique, in my view, I've never read it in any other piece of mineral governance anywhere in the world. The Parliament pushed that in its version of the CRM Act. It was completely left out by the Council. So I think the final version of the CRM Act really represents a very sort of efficiency focused, let's get the CRM Act adopted, let's move to strategic projects approach. The difficulty is that those voices are still there. There is, yes, a risk that not having built such a wide consensus, also because there was a matter of urgency. There was a willingness to get this act adopted as quickly as possible, maybe that is something that remains to be dealt with. Whether it's something that can be embraced at a EU level by engaging with the coalition of the civil society organizations who are aiming to really, weigh on the policy conversation in Brussels, or whether it happens at the level of each strategic project or at both levels is still unclear. But in any case, we should not assume that the debate is over. It's just starting.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because obviously, you look to the impact of civil society in slowing down adoption of critical minerals projects through IRA in the States. This weird dichotomy where we need critical minerals to build renewable energy to get us out of the mess that we're in, and more efficient motors, so we're using less energy, and yet we are fighting the adoption of some of these projects. Some quite rightly so. Can't accept irresponsibility today. We're going to try and build a better tomorrow, but equally some that don't necessarily need to be stopped. They are simply done so because they have mining in the title, which so it sounds like an interesting internal issue to go through. Looking to the outside, then, the EU. You said last time we spoke that the EU has set a number of percentages, 10% of domestic critical minerals, which means that 90% has got to come from other nations.
Yeah.
Now, I have two questions. The first one is, when I was lobbying a long time ago back in the EU, the EU's foreign policy was very much centered around the nations surrounding the EU, and building a like-minded thought process in surrounding nations. So the first question is, has that changed? Is the EU more global now, or does it continue to focus on that surrounding area? Is the first question. And then the second question is specifically around critical minerals. I assume, given that we can't move geology, it's had to be more wide-ranging. And have we seen the EU adopting relationships with nations that perhaps it wouldn't have done so before? To start with, those are my first two questions.
Well, already that's a lot to unpack. So, first of all, as we discussed in our last conversation, trade, international trade, global trade is essential to the EU's, identity. So there is a whole series of free trade agreements and various other frameworks, specifically on energy and critical raw materials. The EU has formed strategic partnerships. So the idea of those is to avoid the long, convoluted, extremely painful process of negotiating a free trade agreement, and to rather focus on sort of a principles level agreement with resource-rich countries to drive effectively a redesign of mineral value chains to mutual benefits. This, of course, can be mining, but friendshoring, and even looking at how industry in one part of the world can facilitate or support industry towards the EU is part of the approach. So far, the EU has partnerships with Argentina, Australia, Chile, Canada, DRC, Kazakhstan, Zambia, Namibia, Norway, Rwanda, and did I forget Canada? I think I did. So I can send you the actual, webpage where they're all listed. What's important about those is that they are open conduits. The idea is to create a space where the European private sector can hone in on some of these countries to, reposition upstream to get closer to production of critical minerals and effectively to participate in redesigning mineral value chains. The complexity is that you need to look at the entire risk equation. And at the moment, I'm not seeing a lot of change in the risk definition of many of these countries as a result of the strategic partnership, in part because the EU has to move from a let's open up a door to an active investment promotion and, frankly, investment protection framework. Again, this is a bit of a shift from a lot of what's been done in the past. There is an adaptation. The idea, I think, is that there's been a whole flurry of these partnerships, and there will be less new partnerships in the next few months and years, and more focus on implementing the ones that exist for better effectiveness.
It seems to me most of the countries you've mentioned there are upstream producers of critical minerals.
Yeah.
They're the mining companies, and therefore one assumes that the EU therefore is focused more, or will spend most of its energy on building a midstream within the EU. So you have raw materials coming from external parties into a midstream in the EU. Is that a correct assumption?
That has been a big part of the conversation. But at the same time, in these partnerships, the EU commits to supporting industrialization of these countries, particularly where there's, a strong call for beneficiation as part of a wider industrial strategy for increased development and economic impact in countries that are resource rich, but otherwise struggle hugely, with development stakes. So the EU kind of has a dual discourse because it very much pushes its own industry to invest in midstream operations in the EU. But again, that requires an ecosystem approach. It doesn't matter if you can process one product. If you haven't got the linkages and you haven't got the hubs that make that product valuable, you're still in the wrong place at the wrong time. And at the same time, the EU is making significant commitments about local value addition. The difficulty is that I've been doing this for 15 years. I'm not quite sure what local value addition means. It's extremely context specific. It also requires an entire ecosystem of investments and commercial linkages and a market that actually values this product being produced in that place. I think we need to move away from the slogans that sound very pleasing but achieve little to a lot of the nitty-gritty in the internal market, but also with external partners. And that's also going to be with some of the partners where it's not about development stakes in the same way. The EU and Canada have a very strong political relationship on the back of CETA, but actually it's really underused by trade and investment. At the moment, Canada is itself pushing a strong, reshoring and friendshoring with the US proximity agenda. How does that work with the EU? And more importantly, is the value of the EU-Canada relationship in the EU and Canada, or actually in positioning together in some of these other places where there's been strategic partnerships?
I mean, I get that. I always think that Canada will always look south. I mean, why wouldn't you? You share a border, right? So that's always going to be a priority. But that's interesting because I think I can pick two nations where you've got two differing things going on. You've got Kazakhstan proactively going out and saying, we want to have relationships. We want you nations to come and help build our critical mineral sector, invest, develop the midstream. And yet, to date, there are some players doing this, but despite the work, we've had an output, which is an agreement on critical minerals, and yet the outcome is not really there to be seen. There's a few people doing it, but it's not strong enough. we, as institutions, the EU or Australia or the UK or USA, have not gone to its industry and said, here is a nation on the border of the EU, huge market for your products. We have a nice relationship. Go and help them build the upstream and the midstream, and we will support you as your host nation or your domestic nation to go and do that. It seems like we've spoken about it, and yet I don't see much return for those relationships. And then, of course, on the very border of the EU, we have a nation that has been keen to join the EU for some time in Serbia. It's had its own relationship with critical minerals. We saw the mothballing of projects of extraction projects in Serbia, 3 years ago, 2.5 years, 3 years ago, something like that. And then last week we saw, or the week before, we saw the court in Serbia not returning the license, but effectively turning over the Rio Tinto Jeddah project ban. So, it seems to me like the EU could play a significant role, especially with its strategic projects agenda, on building that relationship back up there. And it could be used multiple different reasons.
I'm not privy to the high stakes relationship between the EU and Serbia, but
I don't think many people are.
I presume not. But I think what's interesting is taking a step back. What would actually facilitate investment by European pools of capital into both a sector and jurisdictions where they haven't gone before or have exited? Let's be honest, European industry has long pursued, a very strict view of let's hyper focus on where we're competitive, let's offshore the rest. We rely on global trade, we rely on global allies and partners. When those relationships fail, getting European industry to rethink its whole approach, getting European capital, which is already, not the most adventurous, to pick a mineral sector it doesn't understand and to go into these jurisdictions would require more than a single incentive. I think that's where, once again, the shock of reality is coming into play now. It's very good to say to European industry, you need to put your money literally where your mouth is and stop telling us how critical things are for you and start acting on it. But at the same time, you've got from that industry a response of saying, well, any capital that I put into mining and minerals today serves me no purpose in terms of being categorized as pursuing sustainability goals. The EU taxonomy, which was actually a commitment of the Commission under the communication accompanying the CRM Act proposal in March 2023, has gone nowhere. And mining and minerals, which were supposed to come under the taxonomy and be categorized under specific conditions as sustainable investment, has not moved an inch because of a sustainable finance platform, which is basically completely stuck and held up by a variety of interests who are not thinking and connecting the dots. I think there's a lot of requests from investors, from industry to de-risk in the sense of making sure that taxpayers shoulder their risk to do something new. There is a call within the EU, including from Draghi, and there was the same in the Letta report, which was adopted in April, to remind EU industry, EU capital, and EU policy shapers that risk is inherent. And there is a point where we need to get in gear because the stakes are existential. So I'm afraid I don't have an easy answer I do think, however, there are some choices coming up, and they're not just in Brussels. Those choices are also going to have to be made everywhere we process materials today, even within the EU. Do you know that there are processing facilities in the EU currently on care and maintenance? Because the energy prices simply do not make them economic. So what are we pursuing, and where do we put our priorities? It needs to come in an integrated thought process. Probably means that we need industry to come into this conversation a lot more, which means we probably need to rethink how we engage with European industry.
So,
Big
okay.
change, revolution.
Yeah, so it seems to me then we have some two things I'd like to, while we still have time, to kind of discuss quickly. The first one being that it seems that the opportunities within the EU are growing. They are growing quickly, and yet understanding those opportunities, grasping them, and turning them into a reality is a more than complex task. Partly because of the EU's love of bureaucracy. Well, I mean, I voted to remain, but why solve a problem when you can add 7 more acts, right? It's so
Things just look so much prettier wrapped up in red tape, my friend.
Okay, so it seems the opportunities that the EU is giving are just growing and growing and growing, and it is becoming a force in the critical mineral space. It's just very complex to do. Is that your initial assessment?
I think it is complex, and I think, again, going back to the first element that Draghi is pushing back to everybody's radar, scale requires leveraging it correctly. The EU can sometimes be slow, but once it gets going, it's a behemoth. Yeah. So the stakes are now about making sure that we define the right priorities, because once the behemoth moves, it can move extremely efficiently and coherently towards the right goal. We need to understand what that goal is. Will that goal be to reshore processing, and therefore that's going to be how we drive everything? Not necessarily. It's not a great proposition from an industrial perspective, and frankly, a lot of this still requires any operation to be profitable, and that's just not a given. Will it mean that we suddenly think, okay, these are the technologies and sectors where we simply do not compromise, it is strategic, and therefore this is where we put political capital, financing, a lot of consistent effort across various member states? Probably at some point, the emergence of the strategic projects and frankly, the feedback on strategic partnerships will come to some kind of inherent prioritization, selection, and refocus. We need to make sure that we don't get lost in our own noise when the rest of the world is shifting quickly. So the EU, unfortunately, needs to solve an internal conundrum with 27 heads. Not the easiest conversation. At the same time as the UK suddenly shifts gears completely, over one election, no one knows what's happening in November in the US. China is defining its own agenda. A rising swell of expectations from resource-rich countries in Africa, but also in Southeast Asia and in Latin America, is redefining some of the balance and expectations, even for industry. So there is a sense of urgency. But to be honest, I also advocate for us to avoid uninformed urgency, making a decision today because it means it's made, may not be the best thing when you're a great big super tanker that, you know, doesn't exactly turn on a dime.
I was going to say, you know, when it gets going, it's going to be very hard to change course or stop.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And that would explain, I think the last time we spoke, we spoke about how the EU's been looking at this since 2008, but it really hasn't been vocal about it until, you know, the last year or so, not excessively vocal at least. And I guess that's because you don't want to get people engaging and too overly excited before you start pulling up the anchor, right?
I couldn't tell you what the rationale has been for being vocal or not vocal. I also think that there is a movement from global mining, global mineral sector, to suddenly reconsider the EU as a player. In and of itself, that's already a shift of paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
We are already changing the conversation because the EU is at the table. I think a lot of, for example, we very quickly glossed over what happened at the G7 last year in Japan, but a lot of those conversations suddenly crystallized years of attempts of, you know, private conversations. There's now a lot of expectations also coming from the G20 in terms of how do we take this forward? Because of global stakes, we also need global balance and global benefits. I think the EU is not the only one struggling to find its car keys. It's just that when we do it very, very visibly.
That's fair enough. Well, look, so I think, again, there's so many more topics that we could talk about. And in fact, I must invite you back to do another session with us. Perhaps we'll have a live webinar and we can get some questions from people involved. I'm sitting here thinking, well, I'm going to have to ask you to create a CMA EU because I think from what you've explained, it's you know, right over my head. So we're going to need to have someone who understands this, especially as the CMA Australia, UK, USA, and C2A and Canada all are looking now to the EU. What does that look like? What does that mean? How is that relationship? Where can you play in the EU? What are the buckets of money? What's the policies, etc.? And like I said, from the outside looking in, it is a incredibly complex maze you've got to work out. So I'm
going to have to agree with you that I think there is a real need for CMIA's distinct voice in the EU. Let's not kid ourselves. There's already dozens of associations. But the complexity of the conversation between global mining, global finance, global minerals, and the EU really requires a connecting of the dots approach. And, you know, the view that we need to dismantle barriers, create favorable conditions, that's, you know, few short words. The paradigm behind that is incredibly complex. And that's what the EU needs at the moment.
Well, thank you ever so much. We try to do best for our members and make sure industry has the very best shot of turning what is difficult into a reality. We definitely make that easier if you're on board to do CMA EU. But that's a conversation not to be had here. Probably for me to go and take you for dinner somewhere and try and convince you. One last thing that though I was thinking was a lot of what you said. We're starting to see, because the world is polarizing, and we're starting to see more geopolitical issues arising as drivers. And part of that is industrial, part of that is security based, part of that is politics, is leaders, you know, needing something. But there is a closer then alignment around security issues. And of course, that will have a play on critical minerals, surely.
Definitely, at least in the EU discourse, it's a significant change. So in the US, CRM, defense, They've always been in the same conversation. It's always been right up top. In the EU, if you read the foresight studies, for example, defense is a major pillar of the whole thought process. And yet, it wasn't a big part of the discourse until a few months ago. Whereas now we're seeing the defense agenda rise, and we're definitely seeing across the EU a real connection of the CRM agenda, industrial, and defense as being completely integrated in the economic security strategies. So there is definitely a change of pace. The rise of the defense agenda tends to focus certain attention in a very clear and specific way. It also means that there's some conversations which are shifting on the basis of the security agenda in a way they didn't on other aspects. I mean, the EU-UK conversation about defense and economic security has drastically shifted in the last few days, just on the back of announcements from the NATO meetings and, you know, following immediately after the UK elections. I don't have a crystal ball what that means just yet, but it definitely means that you have a whole new layer of points to build agreement, consensus, or competition. And these are not trivial. When it comes to defense, you know, strategy will trump profitability, and there will be an element of decision-making that goes beyond the market.
Yeah. Well, it's another level for us to get our head around, then, isn't it?
Definitely next conversation.
Next conversation. I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to say thank you, Ludivine, as always. You know, you are my go-to person with the EU, as the EU becomes increasingly important in the critical minerals space. Not that it wasn't before, but now that it's more open, more vocal. And we do have a lot of companies outside of the EU looking in, thinking, okay, I'd like to play in that pool, but geez, where do I dive in? You know, it's becoming more important, and yet is still putting people off just because of the complexity. So thank you for shining a light and helping us try and navigate and understand this. I'll leave it there, but as I said last time, I've now got so many thoughts rattling around my head. I'm going to have to invite you on again, just because I think we've got a few more issues I'd like to talk about. Perhaps we'll get some guests to come and join us and have maybe a live webinar and see if we can.
That would be great.
Let's try and think about that. In the meantime, I'm sure we'll have a summer, so I hope you actually get a summer. In the UK, we had a day and a half of sun, so that's not bad.
Sounds like you're off to the races. Well done.
I know, you know, we rode half a day. That's the English summer, 2 days. So we're almost there. I will see you soon, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeff.
For watching. Pleasure.
Talk to you soon.
Stay well. Bye.
Thank you.